You're listening to the 40 Fit Radio podcast, dedicated to the 40-plus community. Join us as we discuss the truth about fitness and health using science, reason, and the experiences of our host and content experts. Welcome to the 40 Fit Nation. Hey, welcome back to the 40 Fit Radio podcast, and welcome back to the 40 Fit Nation. I'm your host, Coach D, and I'm here with Coach Trent.
Good morning, y'all.
Good morning, and today we're going to talk about why so uptight. And basically that title means, as we age, why do our bodies get tighter as we age? And by tighter, I mean less flexibility and less mobility. And so we're going to talk a little bit about those two terms. We covered this principle earlier in the Foundation series, in the first 10 podcasts of the 40 Fit Radio podcast. But today we're going to go into a little bit more detail. We're going to talk about some effective ways that you can gain flexibility and thus more mobility, and how you can improve your movement quality over time, whether that be for swimming or running or lifting barbells or swinging a kettlebell or doing pull-ups or whatever.
Or maybe you just want to be a supple leopard.
Yeah. I'm not even going there. But I mean, basically, there is no magic formula. First of all, here's the deal, guys. If someone is trying to sell you the next best thing to sliced bread, the I guess you would say the panacea or the solution to all your problems when it comes to flexibility and mobility and tightness and some technique or some book or some whatever it is, don't buy it. And I'm not telling you not to buy the Supple Leopard, which that was a little dig by Trent there on Dr. Kelly Starrett, PT. If that's what you want to do, then great. And there are some great stretches in that book, and the concepts in that book there are some solid concepts there. But I think the reality for us as we age is that everyone, well, first of all, let's start here. Let's get off that and let's go here. Number one, there are two concepts that we really need to cover here today. One is flexibility and one is mobility. We've talked about this before, but if you haven't listened to the previous podcast on flexibility, mobility, then here we are again. Flexibility is the range of motion that a joint or a body segment has, not necessarily in function, but its basic full range of motion. So let's take the shoulder, for example. The shoulder inflection, which is raising your arm up over your head, normal flexibility for a younger individual, someone, teenage years to probably 20s and 30s, and even into later years based on your genetics, your cell type, and your predisposition to flexibility, because there is a genetic predisposition here. But normal flexion is about 180 degrees. Now, as we age, especially as males, but also as females, there is a tendency to lose some of that range of motion over time. So if I have a 50-year-old male that comes in and he is, reasonably healthy and fit, comes into my practice or into our gym here, and he has 160 degrees of true shoulder flexion, that would be a combination of glenohumeral and scapulohumeral motion. That's the shoulder blade on the rib cage and the humerus on the shoulder blade at the glenohumeral joint. He has a total of 160 degrees. I would consider that normal for his age range. Is it the amount of range of motion we would like to see in that shoulder to get full overhead flexion, for example, in a press and get the barbell back, or doing chins or pull-ups and get the arms straight with the torso? No. So we might work on that, but I would consider for the normal population that to be fairly normal.
Sure.
So when we think about flexibility, we're talking about how far can a joint move either through active or really mostly through passive range of motion. How far can I take the joint? And there is a normal that is kind of in the medical literature for every single joint of the body. We won't go through all those things. You can look at that up on the interwebs. But there is a normal range of motion for joints. The second concept would be mobility. And mobility is built off your underlying flexibility Okay, how much range of motion do you have in the joint at rest or passively? And your ability to use that flexibility either through strength or your skilled movement patterns. Okay, so mobility is the functional part of what the underlying flexibility, movement of the joint, and stability, strength of the surrounding tissues of the joint, and your ability to have learned a particular motion.
Yeah, so we think about the shoulder example. If someone has very weak shoulders, they might have, let's say, 160 or 170 degrees of shoulder flexion available in terms of flexibility, but they may not be able to hold that overhead position with a very weak shoulder.
Right. And so, I mean, the best example of this would be the mother of all movements. We're going to do a podcast on nothing but the squat. But the mother of all movements is the human squat. And I don't mean squatting in barbells. I just mean the human squat in daily life.
Right.
Squatting down to a chair, squatting down to pick something up off the floor, squatting down for a sustained position, almost down in a squatting position at the very bottom to do something at floor height or at a lower height. But the squat is the mother of all movements. And when you think about a squat, some people may have adequate flexibility to bury their butt to the ground.
Yeah.
All the way down to the ground. Full knee flexion, full ankle dorsiflexion, and full hip flexion, and also external rotation needed to get all the way down to the ground. But they lack the strength to get there and get back up. And that happens a lot of times with our aging population. So they have normal flexibility and abnormal mobility because they can't use the underlying flexibility due to lack of stability or strength.
Yeah.
So there's this constant battle in human joints as we age and as we're involved in sport, activities of living in our daily life, and all these other injury, as we have injuries to joints and tendons and ligaments and different things that happen to us throughout life. And as we age, here's the kicker for us guys, since we're in the 40 plus population, we are more likely to have more variables involved than someone who's much younger, just because we've had more incidences or more exposures to opportunity to have variance there. And so as we age, then our ability to use our underlying flexibility can decline, whether it be to actual loss in joint range of motion and the extensibility of the tissue, or whether it's due to a lack of strength or stability, or maybe we just haven't done that motion very often before. And for some people, squatting is just not that easy. Learning to squat properly is just not that easy. So they need to learn the motion. So there's those three things that predicate a joint's mobility, and that would be number one, flexibility or stability of the joint, and number two, strength, itself, the ability to use the joint in a manner needed, and then number three, learning the movement through neural learning and organic changes in the brain.
Yeah. So when we break down that dichotomy of flexibility, mobility, can we increase our flexibility or just our mobility?
Well, I think we can do both. I mean, if you could increase your flexibility and not increase your mobility.
Okay.
If you stretched a joint and you got the joint more mobile, more flexible, but you didn't have the strength to use it still, of what use would that be for you?
Okay. So you're saying if let's use our shoulder example again. So if we did shoulder dislocations with a wooden dowel,
PVC
let's say,
or wooden dowel, yeah.
Yeah, and so we were able to gain a few more degrees of flexion in that position, but we still had weak shoulder, and we couldn't actually hold anything of any weight.
Value,
in that
even
position.
your arm, maybe. You might not be able to get your arms up
Sure.
very high.
So in that case, we would have gained flexibility
Correct.
in the few degrees of range of motion there, but we wouldn't have actually gained any mobility because we're not useful in that
We
position.
lack the active ability.
Can't produce force in that position.
Exactly.
Okay.
We just can't produce enough force to get there. So it generally, here's the rule of thumb. You can increase flexibility and not increase mobility sometimes. Sometimes they go hand in hand. If there's a concomitant increase in strength and function, or if there's enough underlying strength there and the joint's just tight, then you could do that. But generally speaking, you cannot increase mobility without increasing flexibility. Those things are mutually inclusive. If you're going to increase mobility, you're going to increase flexibility, unless, and here's the caveat, there was enough flexibility already in the joint, and you just had to get stronger. And I find a lot of times, many times, more often than not, the number one underlying issue in regards to having more mobility is having more strength and learning the movement, in whatever it is. But the challenge that a lot of people don't understand is, well, let's talk about this. What happens to flexibility, and then also as a byproduct, mobility as we age? Well, everyone starts with kind of this natural genetic predisposition to flexibility. They start, and then mobility the same too. Everyone can increase or decrease strength in varying levels based on their genetics. Everyone can increase or decrease movement quality in varying levels based on genetics, and everyone can increase or decrease flexibility with varying levels based on their genetics. Genetics predicates all of this stuff.
Yeah.
How are your cells structured? Do you have a predisposition? I've had clients that are 30 years old and they come in and they're so tight they can't move an inch, and you're like, what caused that? They have a normal everyday job. Mm-hmm. They have normal everyday lifestyle, but they're just naturally tight as individuals. Their collagen makeup is different in the connective tissue, the fascia, the tendons, the ligaments, the things that there's passive and active support. We'll talk about that in just a second.
Yeah.
But there are things that naturally they just have a predisposition to being tight. Now, saying that does not give us an excuse to say, well, if you're tight, naturally, then you'll never get flexible. That's not the case.
Right.
It just may be harder for you than others.
Yeah. I think that makes total sense to me. My wife, she's strong. She barbell trains. She presses 80 pounds overhead for sets of 3. She was also a yoga instructor for 3 years.
Sure.
So in terms of flexibility, what by the measures most people would consider flexible, right? Very flexible.
Right.
However, if you look at her shoulder joint, her shoulders, that glenohumeral joint, is set so far forward.
It's got an anteriorly positioned, yeah.
Yeah, very noticeably anteriorly positioned shoulder joint. She doesn't have a whole lot of range of motion overhead.
Yeah, she's very protracted and rounded shouldered. And some of that could be genetic predisposition.
Right.
And the only way sometimes what you can do is, this is so funny, I've done this several times. I've had clients who have come into the clinic with like their grandfather. One time I had the grandfather, the father, and the son. And the grandfather and father and the son were all going out to lunch, so they brought their son to the physical therapy. And if you looked at all three of them, they looked all exactly the same posture-wise. I mean, he was like 16, the father was in his 40s, and the grandfather was in his late 60s, I think. But they had very similar genotypes as you looked at them. And so there's a natural genetic predisposition to have a similar posture and a similar bent towards a certain level of flexibility and mobility combined.
Sure. So we have that can be skeletal in nature or connective tissue related. Like you said, the makeup of your connective tissue, or maybe even like the attachment points of your muscles.
Yeah. I think when we think about how joints are put together, and we're going to do another podcast on just what is a joint, how does a joint work, and I don't mean the smoking kind, but when we think about what makes people more. What tissues are involved in flexibility? You're really talking about ligaments, which connect bone to bone, tendons, which connect muscle to bone, muscles themselves, the muscle length itself. And some people have a naturally shorter muscle, let's say in the hamstrings. They have a thicker, naturally shorter muscle length for the length of their femur. And so there's an offset there in the amount of flexibility they can get in the knee or the hip, as a two joint muscle there. But and then you also have the fascia, which would be the structure that covers the muscle and kind of encases it. I tell people, if you've ever eaten a pot roast or a large piece of meat, it has a thin membranous white clear structure around it that compartmentalizes the different parts of meat. That is fascia. That holds the muscle belly, the individual muscle bellies, and the combined muscle group together in its contained compartment. So all of those elements, along with, and we really don't understand this part as much, but along with the brain and the central nervous system. Your brain maintains a certain level of tone in the muscle, a certain level of milliamps per electrical tone, electrical activity in the muscle. When you're awake, your muscles are never relaxed.
Right.
They have a certain resting tone or a certain resting contractile tone.
Yeah, and so each of those individual muscle fibers are kind of turning on and off just
So at a
bit
tiny
at a time.
little
Yeah.
level that maintains a certain tone. Some people, you can train muscle tone. You can increase muscle tone over time through more training, more resistance training, strength training, and cardiovascular training, aerobic training. Resistance training is the primary method. But some people also have a higher resting tone. Some people, they don't lift, they don't have an exercise program or a training program, and they're pretty hard as a rock.
Yeah.
They have a natural higher resting tone than an individual who is more low tone. And that tone is created by the central nervous system, okay? By your parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. So that resting tone that you have on a regular basis is also created through, like we talked about, the training that we do and the exercise activity that we have in our daily lives. The other thing is that the brain, we do believe too that the brain has a certain limit to how far it's going to allow the muscle to and the structures to go through their full excursion due to potential risk for injury and damage to the area, or potentially also pre-learned lengths, pre-learned maximum excursion lengths, or the amount that a muscle could, or tendon or ligament or fascial connective tissue could lengthen or shorten based on movement patterns that you've done hundreds and thousands and millions of times.
Right. If we go back to the lower back pain series that we did, we talked about how that can be maladaptive, right? So if someone experiences pain, then they might start shortening or lessening the amount of range of motion they give to the joint that's hurting them. And then over time, that becomes a learned motor pattern. And that's the extent of their range of motion.
Right. And they may have more flexibility than that. They may have more mobility than that. But they can't use it because there's a protective muscle. I don't want to use the word spasm because it might not necessarily be a spasm, but there's a protective muscle contraction there. It's just not going to allow them to go into an area where the brain thinks there's pain there. And we have to retrain that person. We have to rethink that. And that's when we talked about the exposure without danger.
Right.
I worked with a client yesterday that drove 2 hours to see me. I mean, it's amazing in the last year probably within the barbell community, I have people driving 2, 3, 4 hours to come see me. And I'm not telling him something that any other starting strength coach in our marketplace doesn't know, or other really good coach doesn't know from a strength perspective, or someone that actually reads some literature every now and then. But having the clinical background really helps. And so I had a guy that drove from Longview, Texas, just a couple hours away. He's got a grade 1 spondylolisthesis. It is unstable. He's a little overweight. He's concerned about barbell training. So we had to go through a full, so before I can say, yeah, it's appropriate for you to barbell train, because I don't necessarily know that yet, especially since he has an unstable spondylolisthesis. I need to look at his clinical presentation, his signs and symptoms, and then decide at what level and what types of barbell training would I recommend for him.
Right.
And so we went through that whole scenario. But if you watch him move into lumbar flexion, bend over and touch his toes, so we're measuring his mobility off of his flexibility and the other characteristics that we talked about, variables that we talked about earlier. He's very guarded. So he doesn't want to move his low back at all. He flexed his upper back, his thoracic, and his cervical spine, but his lumbar spine, he didn't want to move much at all. I think he had 22 degrees of flexion. In that scenario, he might have more mobility. He might have more flexibility than that, but he has less mobility because he's guarding and he's protecting. It's what he's learned. So we've got to reteach him. So part of having more mobility is ensuring that pain is not a part of the formula. Pain itself, if pain enters the equation, all bets are off.
Yeah.
Because it maladapts human movement. It causes abnormal movement patterns that are there. And the more we do that movement pattern, the more our brain learns it. There's a neural engram there. And then that may be what we're only able to use in the future. And that becomes more maladaptive over time, potentially.
Yeah, yeah.
So we shorten and shorten the range of motion because it's more and more protective. The reality is that we need to use that range of motion. We got to teach our brain that it's okay to go into that range of motion and do the exposure without danger concept or model and gradually work it into it, and then fix the underlying problem if we can.
So that's the neurological component of
Correct.
mobility. And I think that's a nice segue into now the strength component, right? Because sometimes pain is not an issue, right? It's simply that, and we've seen this teaching people how to squat, right? They get down, we always start with a body weight squat. We show them this is the position. Okay, now put your hands together, put your elbows in between your knees and squat down into the bottom position, just your body weight. And there's frequently people cannot hold that position. They can't get all the way down into a full squat because they're just weak.
Right.
So in that case, there's no pain involved in getting to that position. It's simply that their brain is telling them, nope, I can't go any further.
Yeah.
Because I don't know if I'm going to fall over. I might not be able to hold that position.
Right. I mean, it's a stability issue. And I don't mean, so let's cover this real quick because this is a very deep rabbit hole we can go in. I mean, I can talk for hours about this. I love this stuff. There are two types of elements that support human joints and that the body recognizes from a neurological standpoint in the joint for its stability or mobility, flexibility, whatever you want to call it. Number one is active support of the joint. That is, the joints are supported. And the reason why we have to talk about the joints when we talk about flexibility and mobility is that we wouldn't have flexibility and mobility without joints. Because joints are what allow us to move segment lengths, use levers in the human body, and without those, then this is a non-conversation.
Right. We'd just be a sack of goo.
Yeah. We would talk about sexy bathing suits today, or something else. I don't know why I said that, but we'd talk about something else because we just wouldn't have those concepts. So when we're talking about joints, we're talking about active stability or active support and passive support. Active support is created or supported by the tendons, the muscles that connect to the tendons that connect to the joints. Those are the active support elements, okay? Passive support would be created by, and in active support, we could also throw in the fascia because it's part of the muscle. It's not a contractile element, but it's connected to the muscle. So it does create support actively. And passively too. But passive support of the joint is mostly created by the ligaments that connect bone to bone, and you cannot contract ligaments. Your brain cannot tell a ligament to tighten up and contract. It doesn't have a contractile element. A ligament is like a rope that has been put between two things to attach to each other. And maintain that length. So if you think of a rope, if you take a rope and you hang a weight from a rope and hold it up with your hand, that is what a ligament does. It supports that weight at the bottom and keeps it from going down any farther, okay? It's static. It's just there. Now, you can put a stretch on that ligament, and the ligament has a certain amount of excursion of lengthening and shortening. Right, but it is very plastic in its nature. In other words, if you take a plastic object and you bend it too far or you stretch it too far, eventually it'll just break. Okay, It'll tear. Now, muscles and tendons have a contractile element. When your brain tells them to contract, they shorten and lengthen through an active bioelectrical contraction, okay? Within the sarcomere and within the muscle spindle fiber and within the tendons, there's little receptors. And so there's a Golgi tendon organ, there's other things in there, but there's an active contraction, so you can actively lengthen and shorten it. So a good example of this might be if you had a motor attached to that same rope, and you could shorten, if you wanted to raise that weight up, the rope would shorten actually, and it would lengthen, okay, and it had a little bit more elastic component to it. That would be a tendon, okay?
Or maybe like a bungee cord.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you could actively lengthen and shorten that bungee cord under, volition. You could just say, shorten and lengthen, and it would do that. Yeah. Like if you raise your arm up and down, if you do a bicep curl, okay, that's active.
The kills for the gills.
Contraction. Yeah, exactly. That's active contraction of the elbow joint. And so those are the types of elements that support joints, active and passive elements. Now, also in the passive element section, you could also throw in there articular cartilage and cartilage, hyaline cartilage, within the joint, because it does serve to create a certain amount of conformation or conjoined joint structure because of the way they're shaped. Like the meniscus of the knee gives support to the knee because it keeps the femur on top of the tibia. And then also the way the joints are shaped, the bones themselves, it creates really good purchase in the joint so that it's got good support.
Yeah. Would you consider bone as well part of the passive support? Just
the structure and the shape of it.
The connection limits the range of motion by the type of joint that you're have.
The more conformation, the more contact surface area, the better the joint is supported, generally speaking, and the less surface area, the more mobility it has, and the more the joint is at risk for injury too, because it has more freedom of movement, okay, throughout it. Like the shoulder joint has a lot more freedom of movement because it has to, and so there's less contact surface area, and really what really supports the shoulder joint is the ligament in the capsule. And then you've got all the muscles that are on top of that, and the tendons and ligaments that get greater support to the joint. But the underlying passive support would be the joint capsule and the ligaments of the shoulder, and then the active support would be the muscles and the tendons and the fascia and all that stuff.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's also what allows us to move. Now, when you think about the hip joint, it's a true ball and socket. The shoulder is not a true ball and socket. It's more of a cup and saucer, but the shoulder is a true ball and socket joint. And so it has a much more conjoined or larger surface area for weight bearing. Okay. And it is a constant weight bearing joint too when you use it. And that joint is going to have more stability than, say, the shoulder would. It also has less degrees of freedom because it's more stable. So it's a give and take relationship there in every single joint of the body. So when we talk about, we go back to what you were talking about, the three things that generally predicate movement or the ability to move through the fullest efficient range of motion. That's a similar concept, isn't it?
Yeah, I've heard that somewhere.
Yeah, we teach that in starting strength as coaches, because just because you can do the splits doesn't mean it's the most efficient range of motion unless you need to do the splits in life or sport, okay? You're not very strong in the splits. You're stronger in another position of hip posture or position. But if you have to do that in your sport, then that is the most efficient range of motion for that sport because you have to have it, right?
Yep.
So a lot of people want to push the boundaries of mobility and flexibility, but what they don't realize is that if you're not going to use it, why have it? If in function in life, you don't need to be able to do the splits, it's kind of cool and novel. I mean, to be honest with you, I would like to do the splits again. You know, I was a gymnast in high school and all growing up in age grades and a year in college. I would like to do the splits again. The likelihood of that happening to me is slim to none. But it would really be cool to do the splits. But it would purely be novelty.
It's like
It'd be a bar trick.
It's a forked road. It's like on the left you have do the splits, on the right you have squat 385.
Yeah, exactly. And so but it's really not something that I functionally need.
Right.
I have plenty of mobility to do what I need in life. Now, let's take this to the next level. So you were talking about strength, okay? So there were three things. There were learning the movement patterns themselves. Number two, the actual strength and stability needed to use the flexibility that you have. And then number three, the actual flexibility of the joint, whether or not you can go through the fullness of range of motion.
Right, the elasticity of that connective tissue.
For you to use, right, the actual excursion. If someone has a maximum of, let's say, 80 degrees of hip flexion because of hip contractures, and I know that sounds funny. Hip flexion is the thing, if you're standing and you raise your knee up to your chest, that's hip flexion.
Yeah.
Okay, like a one-legged stance and you pull your knee up to your chest, that's hip flexion motion.
Or you think about squatting, right? That's an easy way to envision it.
That's hip flexion too.
Mostly hip flexion.
Right.
You know.
And so when you think about that, I've had patients that have contractures of the hips, older patients, and patients with bad osteoarthritis of the hip, and they've got 80 degrees of hip flexion.
Yeah, so that would mean that they cannot raise their knee parallel to the ground.
No.
Or they can't raise their thigh.
Yeah, they'll be really close,
but
for example, for them to get a hip crease below the top of the knee squat, or to be able to squat to a lower chair, they have to maladapt the movement pattern. So they've got to get more knee flexion or more ankle dorsiflexion, or they have to be more upright, or they'll just flop down in the chair to get down to that position. So they have to have an adaptive movement pattern. And so that person has a lack of flexibility. They may be strong. This is really funny as we say this. I have one client. She's I think she's over 50 now. She was a CrossFit athlete. Unbelievably strong woman, crazy strong, stronger than most males her age by far.
Yeah.
Her bench was over 200. She's just crazy strong. But her knees were so arthritic from playing professional soccer. She played soccer all throughout her young years, played soccer in college, played soccer in the Army, for the Army team. Just unbelievable soccer player. And I don't know if her knees were bad for soccer. Her knees are bad just because she overused them. It wasn't soccer in general. Sport doesn't necessarily cause joint damage. It's just overuse that causes joint damage.
Right.
But basically her knees had gotten contractures. So for us to get her to a parallel squat, we couldn't flex her knees that much. So she had to really lean over at the hips, but she's kind of long in the trunk, so we had to be careful there so the bar doesn't get over the midfoot. So we did all sorts of crazy things like, put her in lifting shoes and increase the wedge.
Like a 2-inch heel.
Yeah, and we worked, and she had a mobility program where we squatted her under load, where she would do pause squats and sustained squats down at the bottom of the squat to work. And over time, we were able to get her to squat to the parallel. Not much below that, but to the parallel at least.
Right.
So that's a good example of someone who's plenty strong, crazy strong, but she has an underlying flexibility, passive, structural loss of range of motion. So, but that's a great example. So let's talk about, first of all, we talked a little bit about this. How much is enough? I would say, what do you need in life? What do you need in sport? What do you need in recreation? I like to have a little bit more flexible hips than maybe an average guy my age who's just doing nothing but barbell lifting, because I like to hunt and I like to hike and I like to climb. And when I'm hunting sometimes and I'm stalking, I have to really reach one leg up on a boulder outcropping or something and be able to handle a pack on my back. I need to have not only the flexibility to do that, but I need to have the mobility, which means I need to have the strength to hold that position when my hip gets as high as I need it to, or my knee does, in that more extreme hip flexion position. I need to have strength in that range of motion.
Right.
So thus,
be able
that's
to
why
pull
we
yourself up that boulder very slowly.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And if you don't have strength, adequate strength, and you're not squatting to at least hip crease below the knee, you're only going to have a certain amount of strength within that range of motion when you get to that lower depth. Okay.
Yeah, and same here with me. I love to go hiking. I love to hike in the backcountry and hike up mountains, that kind of thing. And yeah, you need to be prepared to not only be able to handle the big uphill grades, but also just to handle the instability in the terrain. You're going to be walking over rocks. You might put your foot down, going up a hill, and the ground shifts beneath you. And so all of a sudden that puts you in, a much bigger stretch than you anticipated, right? So you just want to be able to, I want to be able to do that stuff without straining a muscle.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, the more you use that joint within reason, and the stronger you are within reason, because we can also become so muscle bound and strong that we do lose some true mobility unless we're using it on a daily basis. And there are exceptions to that rule. There are crazy big guys that are crazy flexible still, and they're the exception to the rule.
Yep. They're
genetic freaks, I'd say it that way, but they are. And so, yeah, we want to be able to be reasonably strong in the fullest efficient range of motion to use our mobility in daily life based off of our underlying flexibility and muscle contraction ability or force production, strength, and learning the movement patterns that we need to do.
Yeah.
And so those are the things that how much is enough? Well, how much are you going to use in life? If you're going to do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you might need to have more flexible hips and shoulders than someone who's just doing barbell training.
Right.
If you're going to swim and do triathlons, you need to reasonably get to 170 to 180 degrees of shoulder flexion range of motion so that you can get your chest down in the water and get your arms out where they need to be so that you got a good glide coefficient. There's all sorts of things like that.
Yeah.
So what are you going to use? Here's the deal. Don't just do stretching for the sake of stretching.
Yeah, I love this story, and I heard this somewhere else. I can't remember where, but Michael Johnson supposedly at some point got a new coach, and they had him. There was a lot of stretching that was in vogue. That was in vogue for sprinters at the time.
Sure.
And Michael Johnson has one job.
Hey, let's make him slower.
Yeah, but his one job is to run 400 meters as fast as he can. Right, and he was pretty good at that.
Right. Yeah, very good.
But
yeah,
apparently,
Olympic quality's pretty good.
Apparently, he spent an off season stretching, just stretching. And guess what? He goes out, starts running on the track again. He's slower.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's like half a second slower. And so, in that
scientifically valid. Yep.
In that case, like, you know what? We want this guy to be super tight because that's what gives him that
stored
explosion
connective
off
energy.
the ground. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, kinetic energy and connective energy, man. I just created a term, connective energy.
Connective energy.
We need to sell that. And so, no, I mean, but now we know it's clear in the literature that runners that are less flexible are faster. If we make a runner more flexible, they get slower in general.
Yeah.
So doing a ton of stretching before you're running, if you have adequate ankle plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, adequate knee flexion extension, and hip flexion extension to be able to perform the running gait, that's all you need.
Right.
That's all you need.
And that makes sense anecdotally. When I played football, most of the running backs that were really good are pretty tightly bound guys. You see them when they run, they hit the open field, and they're, their lower back's tight.
Yeah.
Those legs are tight, and they're just chopping the ground.
And now we know kind of this too. I mean, when you those guys do need a certain amount of flexibility because they're put in awkward positions. If
they need to be able to cut.
They need good adductor flexibility. But along with that flexibility, they have to be strong in those muscle groups because if they have the flexibility without strength in those ranges of motion, they're more likely to be injured because there's just not the ability to hold force coupling in those positions with impact and loads and everything else. So, I found that positions like your running back, your defensive backs,
your skill positions,
your wide
for the most
receivers,
part.
those guys generally work their flexibility more say than other guys. Now, at the same time, I've seen linemen be able to do the splits.
Yeah.
I know several heavyweight class Olympic lifters that can do the splits.
And
that's just because they, number one, they're genetic freaks, but number two, they have worked flexibility over time. And then that brings us to this. How do we gain this flexibility and mobility? Well, we've already talked about. If you want to gain mobility, you better be strong. So you better barbell train or you better resistance train, and you better learn how to properly move if you're doing a sport for that movement that you're performing, okay? If it's for daily life, there are more effective ways to climb boulders and do other things, and some of that comes with experience.
Right.
And you might even have an instructor that's going to teach you how to do bouldering or rock climbing or whatever it is. You might have an instructor that can help you use your mobility more effectively through learning those motions. But we also need a certain amount of underlying flexibility. Maximum excursion of range of motion of the joint, whether without load, just with body weight, okay, and also in a passive range of motion. So if I measure someone's shoulder flexion and they have 180 degrees passively, I measure it and I can bend them all the way. But when they stand up, I give them 5 pounds and they can't raise it overhead to 180 degrees. They go to about 140 or 150 degrees. They have a strength issue.
Right.
They have a strength stability issue when they go. So strength is the issue, not flexibility. But let's say flexibility is the issue for you, and you have joint range of motion that is inadequate to perform normal daily movement, because that's what's key for us as an aging population. And what's happening over time is that our connective tissue is adapting over time. As we age, and here's the simple explanation without getting too scientific. Your body's made up out of collagen. All these connective tissues are made up out of collagen. And as you age, the collagen is changing fiber type. And there's several different fibers, type 1, type 2, type 3, type 4, several different fiber types. And the fibers are going from being more elastic to more plastic. They're getting shortened, they're getting tighter, they're becoming more avascular. The blood flow is reducing to those fibers. The fibers convert, and as we age, there's more adaptive conversion. There's lifestyle habits that affect them. They're sitting in front of a computer all day long. There's all these different, it's very covariant. There's all these different inputs into the equation that affect your flexibility. And so what we've got to do is now we've got to start stretching your joints or your flexibility so that we can gain back some of that normal range of motion. Sometimes the flexibility is limited due to hard infields, meaning you've got a really hard contracture of a joint or you've got a bone spur in there. You know, when I get patients that come in, like say I get an 80-year-old male who's got significantly limited neck range of motion or mobility, I've got to be really careful about how hard I stretch him. Because if I look on an x-ray or I see in an MRI that he's got bone spurs everywhere, he's got spinal stenosis, he's got overgrowth of bone, arthritis and everything, the very thing that may be limiting most of his range of motion is that structurally the joints have changed bony-wise. I'm not changing that.
Right, yeah.
I'm not, and I can't force that range of motion to come back. That happens in arthritic hips sometimes, arthritic knees sometimes, necks and lumbar spines and ankles and wrists and elbows and thumbs, and it happens all over the body sometimes. And various people have different genetic predispositions to that. But let's say all of those things are normal. An x-ray on you is normal of the joint. You have a reasonably healthy joint from a skeletal standpoint, but you just can't go through the full range of motion. And pain is not part of the equation because, like we said, as pain enters in, everything else changes.
Right.
Because it could be a protective response, a nociceptive, painful protective response, not allowing you to move through the fullness of your mobility, not necessarily underlying flexibility issue. But let's say passively you have a flexibility issue. Let's say of your hamstrings, okay? So what is the best way to stretch the hamstrings or any muscle group? So let's talk about that. According to the literature, what do we know right now? Well, first, there's a whole series of different types of stretches that we can perform. And I'm going to go from the least effective in the literature to what we know is the most effective in the literature to be able to stretch muscles and connective tissue alike. All right, so when we think about these tissues,
Numero uno.
Yes, numero uno. The least effective way to stretch is passive stretching. So reach over and touch your toes and hold that position. You could almost say that would be kind of a loaded stretch because you'd have the upper body, torso weight stretching. But another passive stretch might be like a hurdler stretch, where the classical hurdler stretch, where the let's say the left foot is on the inside of the right inner thigh. You've got the knee maximally bent, and you're in a hurdler stretch, and you're leaning forward to stretch the hamstrings. First of all, most of the stretch you're getting is in your lumbar spine, probably. Okay.
Yeah.
And so you got to if you truly want to stretch the hamstrings, you'd have to sit up nice and straight, contract the lumbar erectors into a neutral spine position with the spine straight, and then lean forward at the hip joint and not at the spine. So that method of stretching, passive stretching, is the least effective method and has the poorest response to lengthening the tissue with the amount of work being done, okay? So that would be the first method of stretching. And so static stretching or passive stretching, which would, you might do like 3 stretches with a 30-second hold. And by the way, in the literature so far, we believe that 30-second hold is about the appropriate hold if you're going to do some type of holding stretch. 30 seconds, stretching for a minute is not more effective than stretching for 30 seconds. Now, if you have, let's say, a joint contracture and you have ligamentous tightness or a joint contracture that we're trying to stretch out, as a therapist, I might ask a patient to stay in a particular position. Let's say they have a knee contracture and they can't fully extend or straighten the knee because of ligamentous tightness in the back of the knees. I see that a lot with osteoarthritic patients. I see that sometimes with post-op ACLs or total knee replacements, total knee arthroplasties. But I might have them put the foot up on a bolster or a towel roll and just allow that knee to sag with a weight on it. So we're doing it under load, and I might have them hold it for 5 minutes. We're trying to stretch not just the muscle and tendon length, but more importantly, the joint itself, which would be the ligaments in the joint. Okay, but in general, I think most of us in the world of rehab and in the stretching industry basically believe that 30 seconds is probably the length of time that you need to perform the stretch, and 3 to 5 stretches per muscle group is about right. Now, and we're going to talk about protocol, what I actually do with my patients and what I do personally here in a minute. The second type of stretching would be active stretching. So it might be something like, if we're talking about the hamstring again, because we'll use that muscle group as our example, because everybody would like to have more flexible hamstrings, or most people would as we age. Leg swings. I'm grabbing a bar with one arm and I'm swinging the leg forward and backward. So I'm actively allowing the leg to stretch into hip flexion and extension. And I'm just doing reps of that, okay?
Yeah, I've heard that called dynamic stretching too.
Yes, dynamic stretching or active stretching would be the second method. It's still less effective, but it's more effective than just passive static stretching, okay? The third type would be isometric stretching. Now, isometric stretching would be using that static principle again, or that passive principle again. And when I go to the end range, so what I might do is something like this. I might put my leg up on a box until I get maximum stretch of my hamstrings. And then in that position, when I feel stretch, tension in my hamstrings, the back of my leg, I would then pull my heel down in the box and hold that isometric hold for about 10 seconds, and then relax, and then give it a 30-second stretch. And then another one, 10 seconds. And then I would keep moving my leg up over time, because what you'll find is you'll gain more and more range of motion over time. So that would be an isometric stretch. So it's contraction against an immovable object by my joint and muscle belly in a certain position, okay? So that would be an isometric stretch. So I might do 5 of those, a 10-second contraction, and a 20 to 30-second hold after each contraction. Now, I'm going to warn you, isometric stretching makes you crazy sore. It'll make you sorer than just stretching in general, okay? But it will make you sore. So you just need to know that is the case. And you also need to be careful. Our general rule of thumb when we stretch is we want to be under tension and a little bit of discomfort, but no pain. If you're under pain, your brain says, stop doing that. And your brain is going to stop you from being able to go into a further range of motion, okay? Because there's a nociceptive, painful, protective response there of the muscle contraction and the surrounding tissue. And so, we want to have a slight amount of discomfort, but mostly more tension in the muscle belly or in the tissues that we're stretching. Okay?
Yeah. No, that makes sense. So I think those who are familiar with the Paul Horn stretch, this is with starting strength. A lot of people have trouble getting the bar far enough down on their back to assume the low bar squat position. And so a popular stretch is to do an isometric hold against the barbell in the rack.
Down. Yeah.
You push down, you push your shoulders through, and try to get yourself and hold that low bar.
Yeah, you're
position.
actually contracting against it. You got to be careful because it can create some wicked bicep tendonitis on doing that. We're going to be doing a podcast on that soon. But yeah,
that would be an example of an isometric stretch, right?
Well, that's both positional, and you could really consider that the next one would be to stretch under load.
Okay. Yeah. Loaded stretch. All right.
Loaded stretching, and that might be done as a hold stretch. Okay, like getting up under the rack in a low bar position, putting the bar down on the posterior deltoid below the spine of the scapula, dropping the elbows down and forcing the elbows down and holding that for 10 seconds, and then relaxing and getting a big chest and doing 3 to 5 of those, okay? That would be under load because that's a 45-pound bar.
Right.
And it would also be considered isometric, so it's a combination.
Yeah, because the bar is sitting in the rack. It's effectively immovable.
Correct. And we can be under load without movement. Mm-hmm. And then the last one, which is the most effective, would be under load with movement. Okay.
All right, yeah.
With movement into the range of motion that we're trying to achieve to the maximum depth with reasonable form. And I give the air quotes on that because I'm not looking for someone to have perfect form. I want them to be safe, first and foremost. I want them to use the maximum amount of weight that we can. I want them to perform the most efficient range of motion. And the reason why we do that is we get them stronger, faster, and along the way, we help their mobility because we're driving their flexibility with load.
Yeah.
And the back squat would be the perfect example.
Right.
You want to get more flexible hamstrings, build the strength of the hamstring, and along the way, work on proper lumbar posture, making sure that they're in extension or neutral or a slight amount of extension, getting the hips back, getting the knees out, and getting that hip crease below the top of the knee. That will promote more hamstring flexibility.
Yeah.
I am reasonably flexible right now for anything I need to do in life, and I haven't stretched my hamstrings in a long time. And some of that is because I've continued to work on good quality deadlift position. Okay, deadlift is a great example.
Yep.
I love to use things like the deadlift for hamstring flexibility, deficit deadlifts, Romanian deadlifts, good mornings. Those would all be great examples, along with the squat, of stretch under load with movement. Okay, so all of these things, these are the 4 or 5 different methods of stretching. Here's the key, though: no matter what method you use, you generally got to do it daily. If you're trying to create shoulder flexibility, like using the horn stretch, okay, if you're trying to do that, I recommend that my clients, on their days when they're not squatting, they at least get under the bar, the 45-pound bar, and do that stretch.
Right.
And if they could do it twice a day, it'd be better than once a day.
Yeah, absolutely.
And to be honest with you, if you have tight hamstrings and you're trying to stretch your hamstrings, and you can't necessarily do a loaded stretch every single day. You got to give that tissue a rest. So you might combine different types of stretching along the way. You've got your squat, you've got your deadlift. You may throw some good mornings in there. On off days, you might do some really light, crazy light good mornings. You might do some isometric stretches on those days. But if you're going to improve your hamstring flexibility, it's got to be daily. It can't be 3 days a week. Yeah. It's got to be daily. And Thomas Kurtz wrote a book called Scientifically Stretching. I love the book, and some of the theories haven't fully been scientifically tested out, but a lot of the information in his book, I think he's from Ukraine. He's an exercise physiologist exercise scientist from Ukraine. But on the cover of this book, it's got him in the center splits, and he's got his legs. One leg is on one chair, on the top of the chair. The other leg is on the other top of the chair.
Yeah.
And his wife is sitting on one knee, on one thigh, and his daughter is sitting on the other, and he's in the center splits. And he's not a big dude.
Yeah, yeah.
And so his whole philosophy and scientific approach is basically this: you lack the mobility and fullness of excursion of range of motion because you lack the strength to hold it, so your body knows it and it won't let you go there.
Sure, yeah.
That's the primary reason, he says. And I think there's a lot to that. Your body knows that you're weak in those range of motions, so you just can't go there. So he strongly believes in a flexibility program, number one, that's done 4 or 5 times a day, and also under load, using differing methods of stretching. So my recommendation would be get with your coach. And I'd love to do a series on this and maybe do like the top 4 to 5 stretches for each main muscle group to gain mobility over time, combining the concepts that we're talking about, strength and flexibility combined.
Right.
And proper movement, all those 3 things combined. So those are really the 4 or 5 methods that we recommend with our clients. We've got one guy in our gym right now. He was a member of my CrossFit gym years ago. And we just didn't have enough one-on-one time in that environment. Here at our barbell gym, we do. And we have crazy cleaned up his squat and his deadlift and his press. And that has just been focused effort under the bar, focusing on proper range of motion and stretches that we've given him. And most of those stretches are either under the bar itself, under load, or using the bar, using some other device where he can provide an external force to create more stretch.
Right. And to bring this full circle, one of the reasons why I really like the barbell as a stretch is not only does it satisfy that stretching under load that you just talked about, but it also includes that neurological component, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
It's difficult to perform a squat. It requires a lot of input from the brain. It's a volitional thing,
it's
right?
a compound movement,
you cannot
multi-joint
squat
movement.
passively.
Right.
You have to really think about it when you're doing it. And so And that goes for all the barbell movements. And so the act of doing them themselves helps ingrain good motor patterns as long as you have good coaching, right?
Exactly. As long as you're doing the proper movement.
Right. If you're doing the movement right, then it ingrains good motor patterns. So you're tackling both sides of the equation here, right? You're getting stronger in that range of motion to increase mobility, and you're improving your neurological your motor firing
movement patterns. Yeah, exactly. And I think the other thing you're doing is you're creating joint health. You're increasing blood flow to the joint. You're creating better joint stability. You're improving bone density. We're going to do a series coming up on aging and human tissue and all the different elements: bone, vascular, muscular, connective tissue, organs, the central nervous system, and so and the peripheral nerves. But I mean, the beautiful thing about gaining mobility through strength training is that it works.
Right.
It works. And like I said, we want reasonable form. I might allow someone to have some slight form break if we know we're pushing towards better form. But the only way we're going to be able to do it is to let them do the motion.
That's right. That's right.
It's exposure without danger. Again, that same concept.
So that same trainee at the gym we're talking about, for the first month or two that he squatted to a box.
Yeah.
And so that's not the full range of motion. That's not the 100% correct technique for the squat that we teach, but that's what he could tolerate.
It was the most effective.
It was the most effective, right? And so, but we moved the box down over time,
exactly.
and then we pulled the box away,
right?
So exactly.
Yeah, and I think that we had another female client in the gym that she's crazy tall. She's almost 6 foot tall, really long bone structure, mid-40s, very weak when she came in the gym. Her problem was just the opposite. She had the flexibility.
Yes.
He didn't have the flexibility, and she lacked the mobility due to strength and stability. She could not get out of the bottom of the squat without assistance. And so we had her squat to a box too. So a very similar concept there, but two differing reasons why her mobility was predicated by one thing and his by another. His by lack of flexibility, crazy strong.
Right.
And hers by a lack of strength. So we have that stability and mobility, or stability and flexibility balance in play, that yin and yang there, that co-relationship there that's very, very important.
So, and the last thing I want to say about this is, in one of the great things about barbell training in terms of mobility is that, we're always trying to keep an eye on how much time we're putting in versus the results that we're getting, right? The input versus the output. And, it is in recent years, it's been in vogue to spend a lot of time working on mobility, right? I need 30 minutes of warm up.
I mean, you could spend an hour a day doing your mobility routine.
Mobility WODs, right? And that kind of thing. And the thing is, what are you gaining for the amount of time and effort that you're putting into that? Right? Versus, could you just, do a little bit of supplemental mobility work and then just get under the barbell and get stronger and achieve basically the same thing, right? For a lot less time invested. So that we're always trying to keep an eye on our training resources that we have available and making that as efficient as possible. And barbells really they kill a lot of birds with one stone.
Well, and I 100% agree with that. And I think, within the industry, there's always this buzz to swing to one end of the pendulum or the other. It's human nature to want to have extremes over here or extremes over here. We see that in every cultural movement. We see that in training. We see that in a lot of things in life. And so, I really don't care that you can do an overhead squat with your hands touching each other with the 135-pound bar over your head. It's real novel and it's real cool looking, but it really doesn't necessarily say that you're using the most effective range of motion and it's the safest movement and then it's functional in any method whatsoever. In fact, it's not. What I really care about is, do you have reasonable mobility, which is predicated by strength, flexibility, and the movement patterns that you've learned to acquire over time through proper training, or if it's in sport, proper sport training for that particular motion, whether it be throwing a ball, swimming, cycling, whatever it is, okay? So that's the goal here at 40 Fit. I mean, my goal is that this is not extreme in what we're proposing. This works. If you want more mobility, you got to have more flexibility. If you want more mobility, you got to have more strength. If you want more mobility, you got to have more learning. You got to teach yourself or be taught how to do that movement. So, man, I tell you what, some of you guys that are out there, you need some accessory stretching or an accessory, quote unquote, mobility program. Especially a good example would be like if you just can't get under the bar because your shoulders are so tight, because you've got so much retraction, you've got so much postural flexion in your thoracic spine. Now, some of that will improve over time, and some of that, it may be there and it may always be that way. It's based on what the reason is for being that tight in that position. It could be structural, meaning it could be bony changes over time. So that's where sometimes you need an educated eye, someone to look at you, and sometimes it's great to hire a coach for a short period of time just to evaluate why you don't have that range of motion. Just because someone doesn't have the range of motion doesn't mean it's due to, a spine that's degenerative or lack of strength. We have to figure out why that reason is, what the why is. And so that's important, but you need to most likely have a couple of accessory activities or stretches that you do specifically targeted at promoting that particular position that you need to achieve or motion for life, function, or sport. Now, here's what I'm going to do with you guys. If you would like to, if you'll comment on our Instagram page, or if you'll send us an email, or get on the Facebook page, or wherever you'd like to, and what other social media, probably Instagram's the best for us, at 40fit Radio. You can go on my personal Instagram too, at DL Deaton, DEATON. You can go to Trent's, at Marmalade Cream, or you can go to info@40fit.com and send us an email, or you can go to the 40fit website, 40fit.com, and go to the 40fit Radio tab, and there's a place in there that you could send us an email too. So you can go there, or you can go to Facebook and go to the 40fit Masters Community Group Facebook page and ask us a question, propose a question. If you've got a problem when it comes to mobility and you got a particular problem area, let's try to figure out some ways to help you. And we'll take, a handful of athletes, a handful of listeners, and just give you some suggested stretches that you can do or some things that you can do, and use these 4 or 5 techniques and use the most effective techniques. The first thing I'll probably ask you is, are you doing a barbell program? Are you lifting, and are you strong enough to use the range of motion you have? We got to figure out why that loss in range of motion is there for you, and then we'll propose for you some methods to gain it and why you don't have it, and then hope that helps you along the way. But man, guys, thanks for joining the 40fit Radio podcast, and thanks for joining the 40fit Nation. And by the way, don't be so uptight.